All right. Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the Talking Politics talk series. It's a virtual series jointly organized by the University of Chicago Center for the Study of Communication and Society, the University of Colorado Boulder's Program in Culture, Language, and Social Practice, and Brown University's Department of Anthropology. My name is Slobe, and I'm a postdoc in the Department of Anthropology at Dartmouth College, and I'm facilitating our conversation tonight along with students from my political anthropology class that I'm teaching this fall at Dartmouth. I want to thank all of you so much for joining us in this third edition of Talking Politics, where experts examine how language and other media shape the nexus of race, history, and political institutions. This year's edition primarily focuses on the 2024 presidential election, but our programming also tracks the global movements of political discourses, media, and messages. And we're very happy to host this conversation between Dr. Juan Luis Rodríguez from Queens College and Dr. James Slotta from UT Austin about listening and speaking politically. Dr. Rodríguez is the author of Language and Revolutionary Magic in the Orinoco Delta, which is about Venezuela, or takes place in Venezuela. And Dr. Slotta is the author of Anarchy and the Art of Listening, the Politics and Pragmatics of Reception in Papua New Guinea. Both authors are going to introduce their research, and then we're going to have 4 questions from students from my political anthropology course. And after that, we're going to open the floor to about 20 minutes of audience questions. To ask a question, you can look for the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you click on the button, a new window will pop up where you can post a question. We encourage questions at any time during the webinar, and we will try our best to answer as many of them as we can after we get through the 4 student questions. However, we understand that politics is a delicate subject, and to encourage a constructive and fruitful experience for everyone, including our presenters, we will be closely monitoring the discussion as well as removing any inappropriate or unconstructive content from the Q&A section. So without further ado, let me pass the digital floor over to Juan Luis Rodríguez to introduce his work, followed by James Slotta. Oh, now the slide's not going. There we go.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Hi, Ty. How are you? So yes, I mean, when Ty asked me to do this, I thought that introducing my work will not be good if I don't explain, I mean, the background of what brought me to write this book and why the Warao and why even the title of the book. I always feel that I have to explain why I put magic in a title with no magic in the book. So when I imagine writing my dissertation, which then became a book, I did it thinking of the work of Fernando Coronil. The late Fernando Coronil had a very specific idea of what the Venezuelan state looked like and worked, right? And this idea that he called the magical state is an idea that, even though he didn't frame it like that, is profoundly semiotic in nature, because he presented the idea of a mediation between nature and international capital on the one hand, and the state and the Venezuelan people on the other. And what he said was, I mean, basically, in a nutshell, is that the Venezuelan state situated itself in the middle of this dynamic to bring the influence of the exploitation of nature in Venezuela to legitimize itself and to reproduce itself. So the magical state is in effect a huge semiotic process of taking advantage of nature for the Venezuelan state to gain or to harness whatever international capital can do for them, and nature, to gain independence from its population and actually have in front of the people to produce modernity in Venezuela. So this was a theory of state formation, but it's also a theory of how modernity is produced. So in the middle of all this, what I thought would be good to do as a research project was to understand that, okay, this is happening to Venezuelans, right? But Venezuelans are not just a mass of uniform people. There are many indigenous peoples that are not necessarily participants in this process of modernization, this process of bringing the country to be a magical state. And one of the things that I thought was or that I was confronted with was how is the magical state getting to indigenous peoples that are just at the margin of this process. And in order for me to do that, I just wanted to go to the Orinoco Delta and understand how the Warao, which are one of the, or the second largest indigenous group in Venezuela, were integrated in the Venezuelan public sphere during the 20th century, and how they became part of this thing that Fernando called the magical state. In the midst of me thinking of these things back in the early, I started thinking of this thing back in the early 2000s, and I don't want to out myself at all. But in the early 2000s, when I was undergrad, in the middle of this, I may becoming a grad student, and then graduating for grad school. What happens was the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela. So, and the Bolivarian Revolution came after 1999 to bring an idea of changing the conditions under which Venezuelan democracy was played. Venezuelan democracy was or thought of itself as a bipartisan democracy for most of the 20th century that had brought representation to the people. And the Bolivarian Revolution came with the idea of making Venezuela into a participatory democracy, bringing and folding people that were excluded from this process of the magical state throughout Venezuelan history. So how to do this for Venezuelan indigenous peoples was to change the conditions under which indigenous peoples were participating in the process of or in the Venezuelan public sphere on the one hand, and in the process of voting and getting involved with the government itself. So one of the first things that I noticed that the Venezuelan state was doing in order to foster this participation was that they wanted to start translating Venezuelan law to indigenous people, right? And this actually required a reversal of a constant process of translation of indigenous text into Spanish in order for the preservation of indigenous cultures in Venezuela, right? So for most of the 20th century, being integrated in the state and being involved in the state and being folded into Venezuelan modernity was required a state effort of translating anything that was indigenous into Spanish so that the nation understood indigenous peoples, right? And for them to become the Venezuelan pueblos originarios and X and Y. But the Bolivarian Revolution actually wanted to reverse this by starting to translate not indigenous people, the indigenous text into Spanish, but Spanish law, Spanish written law into indigenous languages, but also the symbols and the signs of the nation. So the first part of the book is about that. It's about that reversal in the modernity. That's the thing that the Bolivarian Revolution wanted to change. Nevertheless, when it came to the integration of other aspects of indigenous life in the political life of the nation, the state and the revolution didn't change much of how the state worked as a mediator between people, and they wanted to make indigenous people now part of the people, and how the state works with nature and international capital. And one of the things that happens during the early Chavez era was that Venezuela started to receive a lot more capital, a lot more money than at any other point in the history of the country. Venezuela received during Chavez's tenure in as president more money than at any other point in Venezuelan history. And the state needed to had the capacity to produce a lot of magical acts, these forms of magical integration into the nation state to a level that we never saw before in the country. I mean, it was really an spectacular revolution of bringing or having this international money coming into the lives of people. So indigenous, the Warao were integrated in the public sphere into this environment that required forms of performances, of gift giving, of political gift giving that they never experienced before. So they were the indigenous, the signs of the nation were being translated into their language, but also the wealth of the nation was brought into their lives in a way that never happened before. Just remember, in the Waraos were lived in a territory that only became a state in 1992, and they gained the right to vote for president and to be integrated into the nation just very recently, relatively recent in Venezuela. So towards the end of the book, the argument became then, what is it that really has changed in the structure of the magical state? If the Warao that are being integrated as people are also integrated into this magical in this magical way, right? And one of the things that I argue towards the end of the book is that the revolution, the Venezuelan revolution, has gotten the magic of the state as a huge rhetorical process of making democracy and modernity for indigenous people that suffer and have the same fragility as that the old magical state, the pre-revolutionary magical state had. And nowadays, with the after oil prices have crumbled in 2013 and back up, but Venezuela has been sanctioned internationally. We see that the magic of the state, without this huge influx of international capital, is probably will remain as a rhetorical promise for indigenous peoples in Venezuela for the foreseeable future. In a nutshell, that's what the book's about. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so introduction from, how do I move to the next slide? All right, James, can you start talking and I'll figure out how to move to the slide with your book cover on it?
Yes, I will start talking. You don't have to put up my book. I hate my book cover. I complained endlessly about that. Don't share photos from your field work when you're putting your book together with the press is my big advice for today. Thank you. Thank you. I want to thank the Talking Politics organizers for putting this wonderful event together. Thank you, Ty, for hosting. And thanks to the students in this political anthropology class who engaged so richly with my book, Juan's book. I'm really excited to talk about your questions. And I'm very excited to be doing this with Juan. His book is remarkable and I love his work. So that's a real treat to be doing this together with him. I'll keep my comments really brief here so we can get to the questions. My book was an effort, you might say, to salvage my dissertation project. I had gone to Papua New Guinea to study political oratory, and political oratory is something that has a long and illustrious history of study in Papua New Guinea in the South Pacific, where I do research, and throughout anthropology and well beyond that. But when I got there, people would get up and give these speeches, which I recorded and paid a lot of attention to. And I discovered very quickly that nobody was actually listening to any of these speeches. They were not paying any attention, which taught me a couple lessons gradually over time. One, that in fact, listening is a really important activity, one that's often not talked about in the literature on political communication, but one that I thought needed some more attention in this context. And then secondly, that these communities looked to be somewhat leaderless, anarchic, you might say. Anthropologists have long tried to avoid using that word for good reason, but there are now efforts to recognize that, in fact, a lot of what the anthropological tradition of studies are anarchic communities. Like the group in the Yopno Valley who I worked with, it's a community of about 7,000 people who live in a rural area with very few state services, very little evidence of the Papua New Guinean state, and very little evidence that people are able to compel other people to act in any way. So the problem for my book was to think about how listening and anarchy are related to one another. There it is in the title of the book. So it's a lengthy exploration of how people listen in ways to try to sustain the anarchic communities that they live in and the kinds of values, the independence, the equality that are really characteristic of the sort of communities that they inhabit and that they want to inhabit. So I will leave it at that as an introduction to my work. I think we'll be talking a lot more about it as we answer questions. So I'll pass it back to you, Ty.
Okay. In that case, I'm going to pass it to Maya then to ask a question for both of you. Go ahead, Maya.
Thank you. I'm super excited to be here, and I truly enjoyed reading both of your books. So my question for both of you is that in your work, you explore the complicated relationship of languages and how they influence political realities in different cultural contexts. And when considering how language alters perceptions of political institutions, what has your research taught you about these similarities all humans have when it comes to politics, regardless of culture?
Thank you. James and Juan, do you want to both go camera on, and whoever wants to answer first can go for it?
Yes, I'm having trouble with my camera here. I don't know why it doesn't work. I'm clicking on it.
We can hear you. So.
Okay.
Good.
It says you can start video because the host has stopped it. So okay, and I start my video. Okay.
Now
So yes, this is an interesting question because for me it has two parts. I mean, what political institutions are we talking about, right? If it is the state institution that you referred to, and then and the other one about the universality of this. To be fair, I never thought about on my project speaking about any form of universality, right? I thought that I was studying specifically Venezuela. My mind was always very specifically Venezuela. So I never had any kind of drive to talk about universalities in that sense, or and let alone regardless of culture. I wanted to do it culturally specific in that sense. But if we're talking about political institutions and we are talking about the state, perhaps my book has something to say about the conformation of states that are, and here I am going on a limb, thinking also of Fernando Cornelio, states that depend on the exploitation of nature, specifically for the conformation of particular forms of infrastructure. So if anything, my book will say or will speak about that has some form of projection onto other places and other cultures or other institutional settings. It will be to states that are one, dependent on the exploitation of nature and the transformation of nature as a semiotic process for the conformation of people and the construction of democracy and modernity. And on the other, as the conformation of a particular kind of modernity that folds indigenous peoples, Latin American indigenous peoples into the state. That's more or less. I mean, that's the extent at which I thought this universality.
Thank you, Maya, for this great question, which I think, as Juan was saying too, it kind of like gets at the Achilles heel of anthropologists, especially when we're talking about our ethnographies, where universals are the furthest thing from our minds in some sense. But on the other hand, I think we have this background of ideas of how the world works everywhere that inform the kinds of things we focus on when we do research. And one of the really common ones is that politics is about speaking. This was something I went into my research with. There's a literature that goes back to Plato, talking about the power of speech. And it's something that has gotten extensively discussed, not just by anthropologists, but philosophers, political communication theorists, and many, many others. And so, I kind of went in with certain expectations, only to have those, I think, defeated, or at least had my eyes opened a little bit to see that a really important character in any sort of political event is going to be the person receiving speech. That's in some sense obvious because in order for speaking to work, someone needs to hear it. But listening has gotten so little attention in the study of politics. And so seeing my interlocutors in Papua New Guinea, like talking a lot about how they were listening, how they should be listening, worrying about whether they're listening adequately, it kind of opened my eyes to something that I had not been prepared to see. And, I think a lot of anthropologists have this experience. You go into the field and you suddenly see a new facet of social reality that you really hadn't been trained by your own background to see. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And so I came back to the US and suddenly I was paying attention to listening as an issue in democratic politics. And once you start looking, you see it everywhere, all of these concerns about how people listen in the public sphere, whether the state is listening. And so it started to become clear to me that this is in some sense, a universal problem. Not to say that listening is the same problem in every political context and every social context, but clearly their listening is a facet of politics anywhere where speech matters. And so I think starting to pay more attention to something that we're often blinded to by our own political background within a democratic society where so much emphasis is placed on the power of voice, the importance of being able to speak, of getting out in the public sphere and shaping the discussion. We should be looking at what's going on the other side of the communicative equation, as it were, because important things are happening there. And I would venture probably anywhere where political speech is an important activity. Thanks again, Maya, for the great question. It was really enjoyable to think about that.
All right. Then we're going to move to the next question, which is Tristan's group. Tristan, are you in here?
Yes.
All right, go for it.
Yeah, so my question is, how do Yopno listening strategies and Waro translation efforts differ or coincide in shaping local autonomy while navigating imposed state ideologies? And specifically, what might those differences or similarities tell us about the respective communities?
Should we just go in the same order? Okay. How do Warao translation efforts differ in shaping a local autonomy while navigating imposed state ideologies? Well, there is, if I think of imposed state ideologies in the context of my book, the first thing that jumps into my mind is the production of revolutionary subjects, right? It's like how does the Venezuelan state expect what else to be integrated and folded into the nation, but is always influenced by this idea that indigenous peoples are the original socialist people in the country. So if you go to the Delta, at least if you were in the Delta in the late 2000s, one of the things that will jump to you as a common discourse, as a common idea imposed by the state, but also reproduced in many public statements, is that this integration of indigenous people happens because indigenous peoples, according to other indigenous revolutionaries like Mariátegui and other people and the revolutionaries in Bolivia, have shown indigenous peoples are the original socialist, and they are the model, the original model under which the revolution should be implemented. Now, how does that influence differently in indigenous communities? Is about it was, to be honest with you, how seriously people took it or not in this idea of being revolutionary. And I was always struck by the fact that the closer indigenous peoples were to the center of power in Caracas, the closer, the more willing they will be to reproduce, or the more fervent they will be in reproducing these ideas of being revolutionary indigenous leaders. And this will be also influence the politics of gender in the Delta. Some of the most ardent revolutionary leaders in the Delta, at least the ones that were closest to the revolution, were always women. I don't have an explanation for that. This is one of those things that will always baffle me. But the closer you get to the centers of bureaucratic power in the Delta, the more you're going to find indigenous women, and the lower you get into the ranks, it will be always men. This is an impressionistic kind of demographic. I don't have any demographic data of that, but that's always been my impression.
One of the reasons I'm really glad to be doing this with Juan is the contrast between Venezuela as a magical state and Papua New Guinea, which is definitely not a magical state, at least in the eyes of people in the Yopno Valley. Folks there tend to be very frustrated with the inability of their state to do anything to help them, and they see themselves as lagging behind other parts of Papua New Guinea that are more developed, and then definitely the rest of the world. And so, in a sense, what makes listening so important is that people there are interested in hearing from, they want to listen to people from outside of the valley to learn ways, ways to develop their communities, to gain access to forms of wealth and power that they feel like have been denied them. And so it's not, I would say, in answer to this question, it's not so much autonomy that they're after. Autonomy suggesting that they want to be, left alone, set out on their own. They want to engage with people. There's a kind of relational quality to their political efforts to build relationships with the state, to build relationships with US-based conservation NGO that's working there. They would love it if a mining company would come around and they could build a relationship with the mining company. All of these things are ways they see that they can be able to achieve the kind of future they want. So in the book, in thinking about anarchy, we might think about people's desires for autonomy and independence, but it's not to be left alone. It's to have control over one's future. It's a kind of self-determination that matters, but people there understand self-determination to be reliant on relationships with other people, particularly other powerful institutions and actors from outside of the valley. It also includes things like the sort of spirits that inhabit the valley, with whom people need to have relationships in order to achieve things. It's with the Christian God. Everyone in the Yopno Valley, for the most part now, is Christian and sees relationships with God as being important. So it's not autonomy, but self-determination that people are after. And it's not avoiding ideologies like environmentalism, like Western education, like Christianity, for instance. It often involves embracing these things in the hopes that they're going to bring the future you want. But again, I would emphasize the idea here is that they would be doing this in order to determine their own future. There is a kind of anarchic quality in the sense that they want to be the ones who are in control by developing these relationships. And they're very concerned that they don't have their future imposed on them by the state, by the church, by NGOs, which is what makes listening so important. If they listen well to what these outside actors and institutions are saying, the hope is they will get the things they want out of them, the kinds of knowledge that will help them to build the future they want, the relationships that they want to use to build that future, without being deceived, tricked, without in other ways having their autonomy or their self-determination undermined. So it's a really difficult balance they're trying to strike in this effort to achieve a kind of self-determination through the support of powerful outside institutions without being co-opted by them, taken advantage of by them, and ultimately left with nothing.
Thank you. Okay, so we're on to the third question, which is Carter's group.
Yes. Can you guys hear me? Perfect. I just want to say thank you so much. This has been really insightful so far, and hopefully we can continue kind of with this question that my group had. So our question was, how did your identity as an ethnographer complicate the research process, particularly considering that it impacted your treatment by the indigenous peoples of the Orinoco Delta and the Yopno Valley? And then kind of a follow-up to that question is, if you could go back and redo your ethnographic work, what would you do differently?
So in order to understand my relationship with the Warao people, well, I always like to tell two little anecdotes about how I ended up doing research in the Orinoco Delta. And it's like the first time that I met any Warao person was not in the Delta. No, was not by me going to the Delta, but I met Warao women in the streets of Caracas because they were coming to Caracas, to the capital of Venezuela, to become beggars on the street, right? So I first met the first people that I contacted and got to talk to about their lives in the streets of Caracas as an undergrad. And it was by some kind of luck that the people that first came to Caracas to do that I started talking to do my undergrad my undergraduate thesis were close to a long line of Waraos that already had so much experience knowing what an anthropology was. I mean, the Waraos in Venezuela are like some indigenous groups here in the States, people that have had a long history of anthropologists go into their communities to study. So as long as I said that I was an anthropologist or an anthropology student, one of the first things that Amalia was the first brown woman that ever talked to me in Caracas. She told me, oh, so you must know Wendell Wilbur. Wendell Wilbur was a professor at UCLA, and his son was James Wilbur, which was at the Venezuelan Institute for Scientific Research. And as soon as she told me that just like it was for me, like I got into in touch with Wilbur at the Venezuelan Institute for Scientific Research, and I started to be introduced to the field by him. So that's how I ended up also targeting Guinea, which is the place where most of my research in the Orinoco Delta happened, by going there. And it dawned on me also this kind of positionality. The moment I landed in Guinea a few months later as an undergrad, and the house where I was supposed to do had these boxes, big boxes, that when you open them, it says Wendell Wilbur Guinea expedition in 1954. So I was putting my things in the same boxes with so many other anthropologists, but I was, for better or worse, one of the first Venezuelan anthropologists in that same community. What made me also have a different kind of positionality, because that also meant that just like the Warao that I was talking to, I was the target of the political influence of the state. People wanted me to vote for them. People wanted me to write grants for the state. People wanted me to be a mediator. I was also all the time when I wanted to do any kind of recording in the Orinoco Delta, I always asked by the Warao people to bring their words to Caracas. It was like me trying to record anything in the Delta was always framed as, oh, Juan is going to record, he's going to take our words and he's going to bring them to Caracas. So just behave. So I was always very self-conscious about doing that, right? So it was kind of like I was for better or worse also kind of as a Venezuelan framed as someone who could mediate at any point with any state institution, which I wasn't. I was very clumsy at that, very bad at talking to bureaucracy. I did it, and now what I will go back and redo in my ethnographic work. One of the things that I will do is to get a little out of that bubble, of the Middle Orinoco Delta that was already carved by other anthropologists. There has admittedly I had my blinders as an anthropology too. Put up by this historical burden of other anthropologists doing research there, and I could say that if I will go today, I will go through probably try to go to out of that Winnikina bubble of the Orinoco Delta that has the missionaries, that has the state institutions, that has there's other aspects of the Orinoco Delta that are not touched in my book that could be done better.
I empathize with people handing you speech and hoping that you will take it to somebody important who can help them. As I mentioned in my well, first off, thanks Carter for and your group, Sydney and Sophia, for this really thoughtful question. One of the things I mentioned in a previous response was that people in the Yopno Valley feel like they have been left behind. They haven't had access to the kinds of knowledge that would help them to realize the future that they want. Me as white, race is very important in this context. As a white American student showing up there, I ticked a lot of boxes in terms of people's hopes that I could help them, that I could clarify things for them in order for them to engage with this US-based NGO, in order for them to engage more effectively with the Papua New Guinean state and the like. And it was very complicated because people were constantly asking me questions and asking me for answers about how the world works, when kind of like I had gone there to find out what they thought about how the world worked. And awkwardly, I'd be attending a political meeting, and folks would be having some sort of a difficult conversation, and someone would almost inevitably say, "Oh, James is sitting there laughing at us because he sees how poorly we do all of this stuff." And so there was this idea that I was a source of some sort of valuable insight for them. At first that was really awkward, and I avoided it, and I tried to not ever play that role. But ultimately, you're thrust into the roles that you're thrust into, and it's hard to change people's ideas about who you are. And so, I partly went along and, I'd help kids with homework and run workshops for people on how to write applications for NGOs and things like that, which taught me a lot about what they were looking for and why they were listening to me and why they were looking to listen to me was helpful. At the same time, thinking about what I would want to go back and do better if I could was that, the fact that I was identified in this way meant that I was monopolized by a bunch of middle-aged men who were well-educated, and they spent the most time with me. They encouraged me to spend time with them. It made it hard to engage with other members of the community at times. And so developing a different sort of identity in the community would have been really helpful for seeing things. There's not a lot about women that I learned aside from what men said about women. There were moments where I feel like I got some insight, speaking to women, going to a few meetings. But I think being embedded more with a family in a way would have been helpful. I got put into, it's like you get classed in various ways when you show up in a field site. And for me, the decision, I really pushed to go for a family to take me in. And they kind of gave me a family, but it was the local Lutheran church pastor who was from a different village in the valley. And so I was put in the space where they kind of tried to contain outsiders. And that influenced the kinds of things that were available to me. I spent a lot of time with pastors and teachers and other members of this sort of middle-aged group of men who were, involved in education, which is why I wrote the book I did. I inevitably would have looked very different if I had been more embedded within kinship networks with a particular family rather than engaging more widely with people. But that's the nature of ethnographic research. It's always perspectival. So, as much as we'd like to go back and do it again and learn more things, there are limits to what we can do.
All right, just a reminder as we move into the last student political anthropology group question, you can leave questions as audience members that we will get to after this one in the Q&A box, which I believe should be down here on your screen. Okay, so I'm going to read the last question. Both of your research focuses on conceptions of truth, honesty, and trust. As researchers, how important do you believe it is to understand how these concepts manifest within a culture, and how does this understanding shape your approach to your research?
Well, this is a huge question. And it's a huge question for me because it has two parts. Truth is a thing that I've been for the last year just trying to figure out myself in my second project, and this is where I do my my plot is this, me and my colleague Miki Makihara here at Queen's College are having a book that is coming out in 2025, where we dedicate a whole chapter to truth commissions, which is a topic we know James is also has written beautifully about, and he has a thesis in comparative studies in society and history that we love. But for in the Orinoco Delta, truth is a thing that has been always part of the core idea about how non-modern Waraos are. The missionaries, the Franciscan missionaries in the Orinoco Delta, has always been very keen on depicting the Warao as people who have a very distant relationship with any idea of facts and truth, and them being the ones who can translate the Warao mind into the Venezuelan state. That's part of the core of the ideas that brought this drive to translate Warao text into Spanish, as mediated by the missionaries, and the missionaries were always very keen into emphasizing their own interpretations and reworking of the words of the Warao into their translation for the Venezuelan people. You know, if you wanted to understand the Warao mind, you needed to pay attention to these psychological reinterpretations of the Warao mind. So that truth is has always been, or not has always been, but nowadays it's less so. But during the 20th century was the great the great blocker of Waraos becoming a modern subject in Venezuela. This tendency of the Waraos to not knowing the truth. On the other hand, there were always and there's always a parallel idea that the Warao spirit is very open to religious truth, right? So there is this idea that they have such a innocent soul that they will be open to the religious truth of the state. So this idea that the Waraos are honest, but not necessarily but naive, and that what you said has to be taken as a with a grain of salt. That they are always have a tendency to gossip. Has pervaded the way in which the Warao has been integrated into the public sphere. Now, the other thing that the flip side of that is the Warao interpretation of the truth that is being told to them by the state. Right, the Warao's evaluation of truth by this the words that comes to them from politicians, and there is this and this is something that pervades the second part of my book, which is this idea that anything that is being told to indigenous peoples, they believe, and they will vote for politicians when politicians just deceive them. And there is this thing in the Orinoco Delta that political talk cannot be done, or is very badly done, if it is not followed by a constant engagement and a follow-up of interdiscursive and relationships across time, right? It's not enough that you come and you tell the Warao that you are going to give and do this or that for the community and they will just go out and vote for you. It was demonstrated again and again to me that any kind of this kind of public outbursts of politicians just like promising things to the world will have to be backed up by something else in the future. And if that doesn't happen, you will have to repair this somehow, right? So there is this constant process of promise, follow up, and repair that happens in what I'll discuss that actually influence how what else see truth from their own perspectives and from the state coming to them. So there is this idea, these two ideas of truth. The Warao cannot be modern because they gossip too much and they don't have a clear relationship to facts and truth. And the idea from the Warao that the state can say whatever they want, but if they don't follow up, they're not just going to believe them. So truth is a complicated relationship depending on the point of view that you put it in the Delta.
Thank you, Daniel, Liam, and Mia for this question. I said this, I think, about at least one other question. This is sort of points to one of the Achilles heels of anthropologists, and that's certainly true of any question that involves truth. I feel like anthropologists tend to be very uneasy in talking about truth, and for good reason. I mean, it's going off into the field where people often hold ideas that one has not heard before, might feel uncomfortable with. Anthropologists have learned, we're not here to make determinations about whether what people say is true or false. We're not here to arbitrate truth. And so truth has kind of been set aside, I think, in a lot of work. But it was something that kept coming up in my own. I mean, people were constantly asking me to evaluate the truth of statements. People would give me their genealogy, going back generations, and say, is this correct? As if I would know the answer, or they would want me to put it into my computer in order so that the computer could determine whether it was correct. So truth is something that people were really concerned about, and it was like trying to figure out a way to talk about that, where I wasn't arbitrating these decisions, whether that genealogy was correct or anything else they said was right or wrong, but somehow taking account of the importance of truth for people there felt really important in this ethnography. People grow up in families where parents and their siblings, deception is a constant. Parents are constantly tricking their children to get them to stop crying and doing stuff. Kids play games where they're constantly tricking each other. If you look at the myths that people tell, they're filled with deception and trickery, and the stuff in Christianity that people focus on a lot of the time is the deceitfulness or the misleadingness of our experience. And so there's this real idea that what we experience is somehow not the full reality, not the full truth. And trying to figure out how to get at that full truth is a constant preoccupation. And it's tied up with the social roles that people play in their community. It's tied up with how they engage with each other and with foreign actors and institutions like me, also like schools, churches, other things like that. So I think paying attention to cultures of truth and honesty is absolutely essential, and figuring out a way for anthropologists to talk about truth without necessarily having to become arbiters of truth is a trick. I mean, it's tricky, and it was constantly tricky for me, knowing how important getting to the truth of things was, and then me having to back off and say, my computer can't answer that question for you. I don't know the history of your genealogy. It always was deflating for folks. And so I don't know how well I succeeded at walking that tightrope. But it's something I think we as a field need to really learn how to do, talk about truth and honesty in ways that don't bracket them, sidestep them, say, everybody has their own truth, because clearly that's not true. Folks there we're seeking the truth. And how do we do justice to their efforts to get at it? So thanks again for these great questions, folks.
Okay, so we're moving into the audience Q&A, and we have quite a few questions and only about 20 minutes left. So if you could, they're huge questions, but if you can try and keep your responses brief so we can get to as many as possible, that would be great. The first one is for both of you. How have your own listening practices been impacted by your fieldwork experiences? Yeah, big questions.
All right, maybe I'll jump in. We'll go out of order. Juan, is that okay? Do you mind if I if I jump in here?
Go ahead.
Thank you, Dina, for this question. You know how to ask a difficult question. As a graduate of the University of Texas. I mean, one of the things I kind of mentioned this in an earlier response, and I'll just go back to it since I'm not great at thinking on my feet, is the idea that I mean, what I became attuned to is listening to listening in a sense. Like, how do you hear how people are listening? Like, we're often listening for what people are saying, as it were. But in the way people speak, we can also hear things about how they're interpreting what other people say, how they are going about who they're trying to listen to, what they're trying to listen for. And so this, I started to do this in terms of politics in the United States. And so, you hear something like, that there's this well-known line that Trump supporters take him seriously, but not literally, whereas the media takes him literally, but not seriously, which, say that's insightful or not, but that's describing two different ways of listening to what Trump is saying. And so you start to hear things like this and pull out and say, oh, right, no, we can actually engage with speech to see how people are listening, because what other evidence do we have of listening? This is the problem with studying listening, is it's something that goes on in our heads, as it were. People might want to quibble with that a little bit, but it's something that's largely an invisible process, except for the evidence that we put out there in terms of how we speak, which does give us some sense. So that's my potted answer to your question, Dina. Thanks for it.
Yeah, indeed a difficult question and to answer. How does my experience have changed my way of, and the Delta changed the way I listen? It is by one of the things that changed in me the most as an ethnographer, as I did fieldwork, was to get rid of this bad habit, and the Delta kind of like shook it out of me, a bad habit of reading minds, or trying to read, to read beyond or and over interpreting, in the sense that I will go to the Delta. I will listen to the Waraos. I will bring these speeches. They will give me those words that they wanted me to bring to Caracas, and they really did want me to bring the exact words that they were saying into Caracas, without me giving them any form of tone or bend into that. Into interpretation, and that was something that I sit down multiple times with Tirso. Tirso was Amalia's husband, the woman that I mentioned before. And every time that I wanted to transcribe something, I constantly ask him, so do you mean this? So what do you mean by this? And and he will always be like, are you listening to me? I mean, this is what I mean. I'm telling you what I want you to listen to, right? So one of the things that I got into my head was that I needed to listen exactly what people were telling me, and to pay attention to people's words was also something that Tony Webster also drilled into my head for a long time, but I did not necessarily listen to him for that until my own also personal experience just like smacked me in the face with it.
Okay, so the next question is from Dusty, and we have taken some creative liberties to make it a little bit shorter, so sorry about that. But the first part of the question, it's two parts. The first part is, how does conspiratorial thinking show up in your respective field sites? And the second is advice for researchers specifically. Do you have advice about switching research topics and also identifying opportunities for interdisciplinary engagement in research?
I'll kick it off. So conspiratorial thinking, hi Dusty. It's University of Texas night here. It's good to hear from you again. I don't know if I call it exactly conspiratorial thinking. I have to think about it, but what was really present was the sense, as I think I mentioned before, that people were constantly deceiving each other, which leads to, it's a strong word, but kind of paranoia. I mean, an ethnographer, Theodore Schwartz, actually wrote about the paranoid style in Melanesia, building off of Richard Hofstadter's classic essay about the paranoid style in American politics. And the idea was, in a context where people are constantly deceiving each other, you start to doubt everything that people tell you. You become somewhat paranoid. That's an exaggeration for sure, but there is a fair amount of that. There's now a large literature describing how people in Melanesia, Papua New Guinea, may or may not have a theory of other minds. The idea that people don't try to read other people's minds, try to interpret what they're thinking, that they don't look for intentions behind action, kind of like what Juan is talking about a little bit. And in my experience, that's kind of true, but that largely is because people don't trust what other people are telling them. It's not that they don't think that other people have minds. It's that they don't trust that what they're saying can give you any indication of what they're actually thinking. That what lies below the surface is something very different than what speech and action are demonstrating. And so in that sense, there's a lot of, you might say, conspiratorial thinking as people try to figure out, like, what are people up to based on whatever evidence they can get. It's a very interesting topic. And then about switching research topics, I'm the I'm in one sense the model of that. Not only did I switch from studying political oratory to developing a project about listening, I started my research wanting to work in the Canadian Arctic and ended up in Papua New Guinea, much to the chagrin of my dissertation committee. So it's not a pleasant road, but it is certainly possible to come up with new topics. And generally, the advice that I heard over and over, and the kind of my own experience is testament to it, is that you get to the field and partly you just figure out what's interesting there, because it's really hard to figure out what that is without knowing it better, and without having spent a great deal of time there. It's not a pleasant road, and none of our sort of funding or models of knowledge production really work smoothly when it comes to sort of figuring out as you go. But there's, I think, a fair amount of that in anybody's project. And I think we should at least let graduate students know that, it happens, and it's, to be expected, at least to some extent. But don't tell Lise I said that.
So for me, conspiratorial thinking, I mean, there's hardly any revolution that doesn't bring a whole lot of conspiratorial kind of thinking. And me coming from the US to study politics in Venezuela didn't help at all in the Delta. Not necessarily from the Warao, but from a lot of people that were state officers and people from the government. They I did notice in the span of the 10 years that I paid closer attention to the Delta from the 2000s to 2012, 2013, that decade or so, a little over a decade, an increase in this on the one hand, this anti-imperialist rhetoric, but also a more and more or an increase in this idea that they will be enemies of the state among us. Me coming from the U.S. and being among indigenous peoples that these state institutions believe are vulnerable to the influence of foreigners and foreign thinking didn't help at all. I mean, there was a lot of conspiracy theories about that and about what indigenous people should not be doing with me, and yeah, all kinds of dramas about that. As for changing the research topics, I think that James mentioned that well. Nowadays, I'm more interested not in the construction of the magical state, but in the crumbling of it, right? We are attending to the crumbling of the magical state. The state has lost its magic to its people, and nowadays the most important phenomenon that has happened because of that is 8 million people that have left Venezuela. And I am interested in attending that. This is a very important part of the book that I mentioned earlier. And that took me to do some research in Chile and some about linguistic intimacy in the diaspora and how Venezuelans are starting to rebuild their lives both in the U.S. and Chile in places where people thought that they spoke the same language as other people, but it turns out they didn't. and how that has impacted this new reconfiguration of the Venezuelan state.
Okay, thank you. For the sake of time, this is going to be our last question. It's also a big one. How might you both go about applying some of each other's concepts and insights to each other's research context? For example, how could we use lessons on the politics of listening from Papua New Guinea as a new lens to understand the experience of Waro speaking and listening to state messages that are performed in Spanish or other indigenous languages that they don't know? We have about 5 minutes left, so.
All right, well, I'll keep it short. Thank you to everybody for participating. Thank you for all these wonderful questions. And thank you, Juan, for participating in this dialogue with me. I've enjoyed thinking about our work together. And this is a great question to end on for that. In your book, you do this wonderful discussion of transduction, the kind of looking at how gift exchange is a cross-modal activity in which, you know, people not only give stuff, but they talk about what they're doing as they do it. And that, in fact, the idea of exchange, which is another question we got, and maybe I can touch on that a little bit too, that exchange is something that fundamentally involves discourse as well. You really can't do exchange without discourse. And this was something that I haven't really written about. I would love to, and I think Juan's work is the perfect a guide for maybe me doing a piece about this. People were really struggling with new forms of exchange in the Yopno Valley. It was engaging with this conservation NGO, engaging with the government. And people understood exchange in sort of a classic reciprocal exchange sense, you know, like they would do something for the conservation NGO and the conservation NGO would then return benefits to them. And so one of the major issues that was going on while I was there was the conservation NGO was trying to develop a conservation area, protect some land, and they needed local landowners to donate land to this project. And, you know, so people were trying to understand, okay, if we give land to people, what do we get in exchange for that? At the same time, the NGO was giving scholarships to people to go to teachers training colleges, young people in the Valley who graduated teachers training colleges. And there was endless discussion. Understanding the nature of this exchange involved kind of endless discussion about what was going on. And a lot of people were assuming, like, if we give land to this conservation area, they're going to give our children, my children, the person who gave this land, they're going to give them a scholarship. And a lot of work had to be done by a few of the high school educated people to explain the kind of meritocratic mode of exchange that actually the NGO wanted to do. They weren't going to give stuff to people who donated land to the conservation area. They were going to give stuff to the best students in school. Very American sensibility. But to watch people try to get that idea across involves so much discussion. It really clarified for me the idea that that Juan is developing in his book, that like you can't do exchange without talking about the parameters of that exchange, the nature of it, and the kinds of transductions that Juan is talking about in the book are kind of a wonderful model for me to think about that. So thanks for the question. Thanks, Juan, for the book.
As for me, one of the things that has influenced me the most about from James's work doesn't necessarily come from his work among Yopno, but this idea of in his work with Truth Commission, that there is this need of a fulfilling of a fatigue function, of a communicative contact between the state and the people in order for democracy to work, right? This idea, and that is as I see it, well, one of the missing pieces of that my ideas about transduction have, right? This idea of that is not necessarily or it's not that it's a missing piece, but it's something that highlights the fact that transduction is also not about necessarily the content of the speech, but about the keeping of this constant channel of communication open. That there is that we are always hung up on the idea that in order for democracy to flourish in this environment, people have to be talking about meaningful things to others. That we need to create these kinds of discourses that resonate with the minds of the Warao, with what the Waraos actually want, with the issues of that the Warao want. But from James, one of the most important things that I learned was that the state might not be doing that. What is important here is more or less that this channel of communication remains open, which is exactly what this cycle of giving, making promises, doing gifts, and repairing the gifts that don't work is about. It's about the fatigue function of all of that, the recurrence of the rituals in order to do that, right? Truth is, and the truth of political speech is not just given by the content of the promises politicians make.
Okay, on that note, we are wrapping up. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you so much to Dr. Slotta and Dr. Rodriguez, and also to my political anthropology students for helping to organize this. The next Talking Politics session is scheduled for Election Day in the US, which is November 5th. The event is at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and we're debuting a new format, a watch party, to engage with the unfolding electoral politics. Be sure to register at talkingpolitics.org and sign up for our email list. And thank you so much again for attending today. Oh, forgot to put that slide up, but
thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Slobe. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.